Lily and Mia Prescott were found dead in their beds on a quiet spring morning, their faces peaceful, their lives stolen. Their mother, Angela Prescott, respected nurse, devoted parent, and pillar of a small Missouri town, was the one who called 911, sobbing that her daughters wouldn't wake up. But behind her tears was a secret so dark, so carefully hidden, it had survived for over 20 years. What no one knew was that Angela wasn't T who she said she was, and her daughters had just discovered the horrifying truth. In the heart of Missouri, nestled between wooded hills and quiet roads, was a small town called Fern Hollow. With a population of just under 4,000, it was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else. People left their doors unlocked, waved to neighbors, and rarely imagined danger creeping into their community. But in the spring of 2022, a story unfolded that would haunt Fern Hollow forever, a story that began in a modest pale blue house on Pine Street. That house belonged to Angela Prescott, a 38-year-old single mother known by nearly everyone in town. She had moved to Fern Hollow 17 years earlier, pregnant and alone. Despite the quiet whispers that followed any newcomer in a town so small, Angela quickly made a good impression. She found work at the local hospital as a nurse, volunteered at church events, and spent her weekends gardening or attending her daughter's school activities. Angela's two daughters, Lily and Mia, were the center of her world. Lily, the eldest at 17, was tall, graceful, and exceptionally bright. She maintained straight A's, played piano, and had just been accepted to a university in Chicago to study pre-law. Mia, just 14, was more reserved but equally gifted. She loved drawing, often filling sketchbooks with surreal landscapes and quiet portraits of her sister and mother. Together, the three of them looked like a model family, simple, loving, tightly knit. To neighbors, Angela was a quiet but capable woman. She never dated, never brought anyone home, and seemed to focus all her energy on her girls. She wasn't overly social, but when approached, she was warm and pleasant. She hosted one birthday party a year, shared between Lily and Mia in early spring, and always showed up to PTA meetings with cookies in hand. If she had any secrets, she kept them buried deep under her calm exterior. On the outside, life in the Prescott home was stable. The girls went to school each morning, walked home together in the afternoon, and spent their evenings doing homework or helping their mom with dinner. Their house was always tidy, the front yard trimmed and colorful with flowers. Even the family dog, a small, elderly terrier named Pepper, added to the air of domestic bliss. But as it often goes in true crime stories, perfection is rarely what it seems. In early May, a sudden storm swept through Fern Hollow. Thunder rumbled, trees shook, and the wind howled through the narrow streets. Around midnight, a call came into the 911 dispatch center. Angela Prescott's voice came through the line, breathless and panicked. She told the dispatcher that she had gone to check on her daughters and found them unresponsive in their beds. The dispatcher attempted to walk her through CPR, but Angela insisted it was too late. Paramedics arrived within minutes, lights flashing across the soaked driveway. Neighbors peeked through blinds, confused by the chaos in the calmest part of town. Inside the house, first responders found both Lily and Mia in their separate bedrooms. Their bodies showed no visible injuries. The girls looked as if they had simply gone to sleep and never woken up. Angela stood in the hallway in shock, wearing pajamas and slippers, her face pale and streaked with tears. She told the officers that nothing had seemed wrong earlier in the evening. She said they had dinner together, watched a movie, and then went to bed like any other night. An autopsy would later show a very different story, but that night, there was no immediate explanation. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no overturned furniture, no indication of a struggle. Toxicology reports wouldn't come for days, so officers marked the scene as undetermined death and left the investigation open. Angela, though shattered and incoherent, was not considered a suspect. The next day, Fern Hollow was blanketed with grief. At school, counselors were brought in to help students cope. Teachers cried in front of their classes. Social media filled with tributes to the Prescott girls. Their smiling faces appeared on news segments across the state. Everyone mourned the loss of two promising lives, and everyone offered sympathy to the mother left behind. Angela spent most of that week inside her house, away from the cameras and the curious eyes of her neighbors. She released a statement through the hospital asking for privacy. She canceled all her upcoming shifts. Friends dropped off food and cards. The local church took up a collection to help cover funeral costs. In the face of overwhelming tragedy, the town rallied around her. The funeral was held 4 days later. The church pews overflowed with mourners. 2 white caskets sat at the altar, surrounded by photographs and flowers. Angela sat alone in the front row, eyes hollow and hands clasped tightly in her lap. She didn't speak. She didn't move. When the service ended, she stood slowly, walked to each casket, and placed a single rose on top. From the outside, it looked like the end of a tragic story. A mother had lost her children. A family had been destroyed. A town had come together in grief. But it wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Behind the sorrow, behind the tears and the flowers and the solemn music, lay a darkness that no one yet suspected. The truth about what had happened in that quiet blue house on Pine Street was far more horrifying than anyone could imagine. And Angela Prescott was not the grieving mother she appeared to be. 4 days after the sudden deaths of Lily and Mia Prescott, the town of Fern Hollow gathered in mourning. The church was packed beyond capacity. People stood shoulder to shoulder in the aisles, lining the back walls and spilling out onto the lawn, all to pay their respects. Many of them didn't know the girls personally, but that didn't matter. In a town so small, a loss like this felt like it belonged to everyone. Angela Prescott sat in the front pew, motionless. Her face was pale, eyes glassy. Her hands rested in her lap, clenched tightly around a folded handkerchief. She didn't cry during the service. She didn't speak. Only when the caskets were wheeled down the center aisle did she seem to flinch, her body rocking ever so slightly as if some invisible blow had struck her. The service itself was quiet and respectful. Teachers from the local high school read short statements about the girls. Lily's debate coach recalled her passion for justice. Mia's art teacher spoke about her gentle nature and vivid imagination. Photos of the girls smiling, laughing, growing up together, played across a large projector screen behind the altar. Some in the crowd sobbed, others just stared. The silence afterward was deep, the kind of silence that settles into bones. After the funeral, most people tried to return to normal life, but something had changed. The Prescott house remained dark. The once cheerful garden out front began to wither. Pepper, the family's old terrier, was taken in by a neighbor who said the dog had started pacing and whining at the door every night, confused and restless. Though Angela was offered counseling, she declined. She stayed inside her house, rarely seen, rarely heard. A few close friends visited to bring meals, but Angela mostly kept to herself. The town respected her space, believing that any mother in her position had a right to grieve in silence. But the police did not stop working. Autopsy results were slow to arrive, but when they did, they raised immediate red flags. Both Lily and Mia had traces of diphenhydramine in their systems, commonly found in over-the-counter sleep aids. but the doses were far beyond what any responsible parent would give. Toxicologists confirmed that the levels were not just high, they were lethal. It was no longer possible to call this a natural death. It wasn't a tragic accident. It wasn't environmental, like carbon monoxide. It was deliberate. Someone had drugged the girls, and given the timeline and lack of physical evidence pointing to a break-in, detectives were left with a narrow field of suspects. Angela became the obvious focus. She had been alone in the house with them that night. There were no signs of forced entry, no signs of a struggle, and no history of the girls having access to such a substance on their own. It didn't add up. Still, the detectives had to tread carefully. In the eyes of the town, Angela was a grieving mother, not a murderer. There was no physical evidence tying her to the administration of the drugs, no fingerprints on the pill bottles, no witness testimony, and no confession. But suspicion grew steadily. Detectives began to re-examine every part of Angela's life. They started with her job at the hospital, questioning co-workers and supervisors. Most described her as quiet, professional, and private. A few admitted she was sometimes evasive about her past, but dismissed it as personal trauma. She never talked about her childhood, her family, or where she was born. She claimed to have moved from Georgia, but there were no records to back that up. Her personnel file was curiously sparse for someone who had been employed for nearly a decade. Curiosity turned to concern when investigators began pulling public records and found almost nothing: no marriage certificate, no school transcripts, no property history prior to moving to Fern Hollow in 2005. Her social security number had been issued late, in her early 20s, which is highly unusual. She had no driver's license history before arriving in Missouri. There was no digital trail, no credit history, no social media footprint, no distant relatives listed anywhere. Angela Prescott, it seemed, had materialized out of nowhere. Detectives reached out to federal databases, hoping for a match to a missing person, a cold case, a fraud investigation, anything. In the meantime, they obtained a search warrant for the Prescott home. What they found only deepened the mystery. Hidden in a bedroom drawer, beneath old paperwork and receipts, was a small lockbox. Inside were a few old photographs, several faded documents, and a birth certificate. But the name on the certificate wasn't Angela Prescott. It was Rachel Monroe. The photos showed a girl in her teens, with the same face as Angela, but younger, harder, and unrecognizable to anyone in Fern Hollow. There were no pictures of Lily or Mia in the box. No evidence of the life Angela had supposedly built. Just fragments of a different identity. Investigators also found a newspaper clipping folded tightly into the bottom of the lockbox. The headline read, "Tallahassee family dies in suspicious house fire. One daughter missing." The date was from 1999. The article described a family of 5 killed in a late-night blaze. The only person unaccounted for was the oldest child, a 17-year-old named Rachel Monroe. The fire was ruled suspicious. Accelerants were found. The girl was never seen again. With this revelation, the investigation took a sharp turn. Angela Prescott wasn't who she said she was, and now it appeared she had been hiding a much darker past than anyone could have guessed. The pieces were beginning to fall into place. Lily and Mia hadn't died by chance. They hadn't died from a tragic accident. They had discovered something they weren't supposed to know, something about the woman who raised them, and for that, they paid the ultimate price. Angela Prescott had fooled an entire town, but her daughters saw through the lie. With the discovery of the lockbox and the name Rachel Monroe, the investigation into the deaths of Lily and Mia Prescott shifted from local tragedy to something far more complex and sinister. Detectives in Fern Hollow had stumbled onto the thread of a mystery that stretched across state lines and spanned over 2 decades. The simple image of a grieving mother was crumbling, replaced by the outline of a woman who had lived under a false identity and may have committed far more than one crime. The article from 1999, found folded in the bottom of the box, was yellowed with age and wrinkled from years of being hidden. It told of a house fire in Tallahassee, Florida, that had claimed the lives of 2 parents and 2 young boys. According to the article, the family had been asleep when the fire started just after midnight. Investigators had suspected arson due to the presence of accelerants, but no arrests had ever been made. The most haunting detail was the missing daughter. Rachel Monroe, age 17, had vanished the night of the fire. She was never found, and the case had gone cold. Now, more than 20 years later, the pieces were beginning to connect. Angela Prescott, the quiet nurse and devoted mother from Fern Hollow, bore a striking resemblance to the photos of Rachel Monroe. DNA collected from the Prescott home was sent for comparison to DNA profiles from the fire investigation. It wasn't long before the results came back. A match. Angela was Rachel. This revelation shook the small-town police department. They reached out to law enforcement in Tallahassee, sharing their findings. A retired detective who had worked the original fire case was brought in to consult. He remembered the Monroe family well. It had been one of the most disturbing cases of his career. At the time, Rachel had been considered a possible victim, but also a possible suspect. There had been reports of tension at home, rumors of fights between her and her parents. Some even believed she had been abused, though nothing was ever proven. When she disappeared, some thought she had run away, maybe even died in the fire. But now it was clear. She had survived and built a new life under a new name. Rachel Monroe had disappeared on the night her family died. She had resurfaced 6 years later in Missouri as Angela Prescott, pregnant and alone. Where she had been during that gap remained unclear, but her trail officially began in 2005 when she arrived in Fern Hollow and registered under her new identity. As detectives dug deeper, they began to realize how carefully Rachel had constructed her new life. She had obtained a fake birth certificate and social security number. She had never used a credit card, never applied for a passport, never traveled. She kept a low profile, never drawing attention, never revealing anything about her past. She avoided cameras, social media, and close friendships. Everything about her was intentional. The real breakthrough came when they reviewed the academic records of Lily, her older daughter. Weeks before her death, Lily had been working on a school project that required researching family history. She had asked her mother for details about where she was born, her grandparents, and other relatives. Angela had reportedly become evasive, claiming she didn't remember much and had lost contact with her family years ago. But Lily had pressed on. She had accessed an ancestry website and started digging into records. Investigators found a trail of internet searches in Lily's laptop history. Rachel Monroe, Tallahassee Fire 1999, and Missing Person Florida. It was clear she had stumbled onto something, or was at least starting to suspect that her mother wasn't who she claimed to be. Mia's search history showed she had been talking with Lily about it. The younger sister had looked up the same newspaper article, read the same story. The detectives believed that the girls were planning to confront their mother, or maybe even report her. They didn't realize how dangerous that would be. The timeline became chillingly clear. Days after those searches were made, the girls were dead. Angela had seen what they were doing. Maybe she found the browser history, or perhaps overheard a conversation. Either way, she understood the risk. If the truth came out, everything she had built would collapse. Her secret would be exposed, and she would go to prison not only for identity fraud, but for the deaths of her family 2 decades earlier. Faced with the threat of exposure, she made a decision. She bought the sleep aid at a local pharmacy. Security footage showed her at the counter, paying in cash, looking calm. The next day, she prepared dinner for her daughters as usual. She crushed the tablets into their drinks or food. Detectives were never able to determine exactly how the drug was administered. What they did know was that the girls never woke up. Angela had chosen silence over confession. She had chosen to bury her secret, even if it meant burying her daughters too. After the toxicology reports confirmed the presence of the drugs, and the DNA results tied Angela to the Monroe family, the district attorney approved a warrant for her arrest. When officers arrived at her home, she didn't resist. She didn't run. She stood quietly in the doorway, her face unreadable, and allowed herself to be taken into custody. It was the end of the illusion. Angela Prescott, the grieving mother, was gone. All that remained was Rachel Monroe, a fugitive, a liar, and now a murderer. In the days following Angela Prescott's arrest, the town of Fern Hollow descended into a stunned silence. The news spread quickly, faster than anyone could fully process. For weeks, people had mourned with her, prayed for her, brought food to her door, and cried at the loss of her daughters. Now they were being told that the woman they had embraced was not only a fraud, but a killer. The community felt betrayed, even violated. The image of the grieving mother had been completely shattered, replaced by the far more chilling reality of a woman who had lived 2 lives and destroyed both. Angela was transferred to a secure facility pending trial. Though her face was now known nationwide, she refused to speak to the media. Her attorney initially argued that there had been a terrible misunderstanding, but behind closed doors, investigators were beginning to hear the full story. With the mounting evidence, Angela eventually gave a full confession, and what she revealed was more disturbing than anyone had expected. She admitted that she had been born Rachel Monroe and had grown up in Tallahassee, Florida. Her childhood had been troubled. Her parents were strict and deeply religious, enforcing harsh rules and punishments. Rachel described years of emotional abuse and occasional physical violence, particularly from her father. According to her statement, she had run away several times, only to be dragged back home. Her younger brothers, still in elementary school at the time, were treated more gently, but Rachel felt like a prisoner. The turning point came in the summer of 1999. She had just turned 17 and had begun planning an escape. She gathered cash, hid a bag of clothes, and waited for the right night. But the night she chose didn't go as planned. An argument erupted between her and her parents. Rachel said she snapped. In a rage, she poured gasoline in the garage and lit a match, believing she had time to get her brothers out first. But the fire spread faster than she expected. The heat and smoke overwhelmed her. She panicked and ran, never looking back. She watched the house burn from a distance. Afterward, Rachel fled the state. She hitchhiked across the country, sleeping in bus stations, working under the table, and using fake names. For a few years, she stayed in and out of shelters. At one point, she was nearly caught in Texas during a routine police check, but she gave a false name and slipped away. Eventually, she made her way to Missouri, where she assumed a new identity using forged documents. That's when she became Angela Prescott. By the time she arrived in Fern Hollow, she was pregnant with Lily. She never disclosed who the father was, and that part of her past remained sealed. Angela settled into small-town life, knowing that in a quiet place like Fern Hollow, questions were rarely asked if you kept your head down and contributed to the community. She worked hard to blend in, building a life that appeared normal on the surface. But beneath that surface, she lived in constant fear. Every knock at the door, every unfamiliar car, every request for identification sent her heart racing. The past never felt far away. She knew her secret was fragile. Just one mistake, one curious neighbor, one online search away from collapse. And when Lily began digging into her family history, that fragile illusion cracked. Angela explained in her confession that Lily had grown increasingly curious about her roots. The school project had been the beginning, but it didn't end there. Lily had started asking questions, pushing for answers, questioning the vague stories Angela had told over the years. At first, Angela dismissed it as teenage curiosity. But when she discovered that Lily had searched her real name, Rachel Monroe, Angela panicked. She confronted Lily, who denied it at first, but later admitted she had found the article about the fire. According to Angela, Lily said she didn't believe it could be true, but she had to know. She wanted the truth. Mia, younger and more trusting, had followed her sister's lead and started reading about it too. Angela knew it was only a matter of time before they told someone, perhaps a teacher, a friend, even the police. Angela claimed she felt cornered, like everything she had built was about to be taken from her. In her words, she had no choice. But investigators didn't see it that way. There had been many choices. She had chosen to run. She had chosen to lie. And she had chosen to kill. Again. On the night of the murders, Angela carefully crushed the sleep medication and mixed it into food or drinks. The girls went to bed as usual. They never woke up. When Angela called 911 later that night, she played her role to perfection. But the entire scene had been staged. She knew what had happened. She had planned it. Her confession, while thorough, did little to help her in court. The prosecution was building a case for premeditated murder. The evidence was overwhelming. Digital search history, pharmacy receipts, the toxicology reports, the DNA match to the Monroe family, and most damning of all, Angela's own words. She had killed to keep a secret, one born from another violent act committed decades earlier. Angela Prescott had spent her adult life trying to bury the past. But in the end, the truth rose from the ashes, just like the fire she started long ago. The horror of what she did wasn't just in the crimes themselves. It was in the way she hid behind motherhood, behind normalcy, behind a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She built her entire world around deception. And when that world began to crack, she destroyed the only people who truly loved her. Fern Hollow would never forget the name Angela Prescott. But even more chilling was the name they had never known until it was too late. Rachel Monroe. Angela Prescott's trial began on a cold December morning, nearly 7 months after her arrest. By then, the nation had turned its attention to the case. News outlets from across the country lined up outside the courthouse in Fern Hollow. The quiet town that once offered Angela sanctuary was now the epicenter of one of the most disturbing true crime cases in recent memory. Everyone wanted to hear how a mother could murder her own daughters to keep a secret buried for over 2 decades. Inside the courtroom, Angela sat silently beside her defense attorney, dressed in a plain suit with her hair pulled back. Her expression was blank, unreadable. Gone was the soft-spoken nurse the town had known. In her place was a woman facing 2 counts of first-degree murder, aggravated identity fraud, and potential charges related to the arson in Florida that killed her biological family. The prosecution laid out their case with devastating precision. They detailed how Lily and Mia Prescott had been deliberately drugged with a lethal dose of diphenhydramine, a sleep aid that Angela had purchased just days before their deaths. They presented evidence from Lily S.'s school project that showed she had been researching her family history and discover the true identity of her mother. They showed computer records, browser histories, and text messages between the sisters in which they discussed their suspicions and agreed to confront Angela. Prosecutors didn't need to paint a picture of a woman out of control. Instead, they painted one of cold calculation. Angela, they argued, had lived for over 20 years, under a false name, built a new life with new identities for herself and her daughters, and when the truth was on the verge of being exposed, she calmly and methodically ended the lives of the only two people who knew her best. The defense had few options. Angela had already confessed. Her DNA linked her to the Monroe family. The evidence was airtight. Her legal team focused on her traumatic childhood, the abuse she claimed to have endured, and the mental health struggles she faced after the fire in Florida. They argued that Angela had been living in a constant state of fear, shaped by years of emotional damage. They asked for leniency on the grounds of diminished capacity, portraying her not as a monster, but as a broken woman who snapped under the weight of a life built on lies. But the jury didn't see it that way. After only 2 days of deliberation, they returned with a unanimous verdict: guilty on all counts. Angela Prescott, also known as Rachel Monroe, was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentencing brought some closure to the town, but it didn't erase the scars. People who had once defended Angela now struggled to reconcile how easily they had been fooled. Teachers who had praised her involvement in school events were haunted by memories of her smiling face. Her co-workers at the hospital, some of whom had worked beside her for years, couldn't believe the woman they knew had such a dark past. Perhaps most affected were the classmates and friends of Lily and Mia. They had lost more than 2 peers. They had lost trust in the safety and predictability of their world. At a candlelight vigil held a week after the sentencing, hundreds gathered at the local park. There were no speeches, no cameras, just quiet remembrance. People lit candles, left drawings and letters, and placed flowers beneath 2 photos of the girls. A handwritten sign read, "We remember the light, not the shadow." But questions still lingered. How had Angela kept her secret for so long? How had she forged documents and fooled background checks? Investigators admitted there were gaps in oversight. In 2005, digital systems were not as interconnected as they are today. A woman with no prior records could, with enough caution and planning, create a new identity and start over. Angela had done just that. She had kept to herself, stayed under the radar, and avoided situations that could expose her past. It was only when her daughters, curious and intelligent, started to ask questions that the truth began to surface. In prison, Angela reportedly spends most of her time alone. She does not receive visitors. No family members from either life have reached out to her. She declined interviews and has never spoken publicly since the trial. According to prison staff, she remains quiet and compliant, rarely interacting with others. She reads, she writes, and she keeps to herself, just as she did for years before her world collapsed. The legacy of her crimes is felt far beyond Fern Hollow. Her story has been the subject of books, podcasts, and documentaries. Some paint her as a tragic figure, a product of trauma and fear. Others see her as a manipulator who used motherhood as a mask. But regardless of interpretation, one truth remains undeniable. Angela Prescott killed her daughters not out of rage or impulse, but to protect a secret she had carried for half her life. She chose silence over redemption, and in doing so she ensured that her daughters, who only sought the truth, would never have the chance to live their own. Their story is a chilling reminder that sometimes the people we trust the most, the ones who smile the widest and hug the hardest, are hiding the darkest truths of all.